Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Saints of the Week here at the Things That Don't Change. Happy Easter. Alleluia. He is risen. I hope everyone had a good octave of Easter. I know it's been a bit weird this year, with the passing of Pope Francis. But we're kind of still in the season. As we mourn, we also remember our joy in the resurrection, and the life of the world to come. So this week we have a lot of saints. So I'm going to kind of get into things here. I'm not going to be able to tackle every single saint. We have like 8 saints this week that have feast days. Unfortunately, I was only able to get to about 4. So we'll kind of go into those and then also give a little details about the ones that we missed there. Starting right off, the first saint we have for April 28th is Saint Louis de Montfort. A big name here. A lot of big names this week. A lot of saints and a lot of big name saints. So we're starting off with Louis de Montfort, who was born on the 31st of January in 1673. At Montfort, which is near Rennes in Brittany, which is kind of northwestern France. So Saint Louis, even as a child, he had a very great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. And by age of 12, he was studying, with the Jesuits. And while he was in school, even as a young kid, he and a group of young men who he went to school with, would minister to the poor and to the sick. By age of 19, he went to Paris to study theology. And then at the age of 27, he was kind of ordained a priest. So again, from a very early age, St. Louis was very, very much taken with religion. He was a very holy, very faithful child, young man, and now finally priest. In 1705, when he was 32, he found his calling. He spent a couple of years in kind of regular diocesan priesthood, but by the age of 32, he kind of found that his calling was really more in just preaching and kind of going out in a very St. Paul fashion and just kind of preaching the gospel to everybody who he could find to do so. So he became somewhat of an itinerant preacher. He actually got permission from the Pope himself, Pope Clement the 11th in 1706. He got permission to kind of pursue this life of just kind of itinerant preaching. He became what is known as a missionary apostolic, basically, in kind of a St. Paul fashion, just kind of going from town to town, preaching the gospel, helping the sick, giving an example, educating, the people, that type of thing. So, while he was doing this work, St. Louis lived a very simplistic life, very austere life of holiness, and thousands followed his preaching, kind of hooked on every word that he had. We know one of the things that he recommended, since he had this great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, he recommended just to very frequently receive Holy Communion at kind of around this time in France. That wasn't something that was done a whole lot, so he was just, very big on championing, the reception of the sacraments, especially the Holy Eucharist, is something that we should all kind of be doing more of in our lives. He came into conflict with the Jansenists during this period. We spoke about the Jansenists a couple weeks ago. We were talking about Saint John Baptiste de La Salle, who also was in France around the same time. And the Jansenists were a group who were named for a bishop named Cornelius Jansen, who was Bishop of Leuven in Belgium from 1635 to 1638. He was, bishop during that time. And, he would get engaged in kind of these debates about human free will and kind of exposit these different ideas. But the kind of the funny thing is that Jansen wasn't actually a Jansenist. It's just that the Jansenists were people who took those ideas and kind of ran with them, to kind of like this extreme conclusion. And they became kind of convinced, that they denied that free will is a thing. They're convinced that, kind of God kind of elects and predestines, who is saved, who receives his grace, and then those who don't are just chosen not to. So kind of similar to some of the Calvinist ideas, like irresistible grace, and the kind of the tulip ideas. So this, of course, was condemned as a heresy. That's not how Catholics view the idea of free will. They were just very active in France around this time. They caused a lot of problems, especially for, as we spoke of, Saint John Baptiste de La Salle, and also now for Saint Louis de Montfort and his preaching. But, regardless, Saint Louis was an ardent defender of the Catholic truth on this matter. He was also very devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary. If you've ever heard of him, you've probably heard of, his one of his works, the total consecration of Jesus through Mary. So he had like a very, very deep devotion to our Blessed Mother. And he actually founded a missionary group known as the Missionaries of the Company of Mary in 1713. This was kind of like the culmination of his life's work. He had this great devotion to Mary, and he just wanted to kind of create this community of priests to just really honor her and carry out missionary work for the Lord, while also kind of keeping her very in close focus as their patron in doing that, caring for the sick, caring for the poor, caring for the destitute. However, unfortunately, St. Louis wasn't really able to see this group that he founded really take off very well. He, like I said, founded it in 1713. He actually passed away on April 28th at 1716. So only 3 years after he actually got permission to found the society, he ended up passing away. However, a disciple of his, a priest named Father Mulot, he became his successor in the position as the leader of the society, and it really started to kind of pick up, going into the decades after that. So, St. Louis de Montfort was beatified by Pope Leo XIII in the year 1888, and then he was finally canonized by Pope Pius XII in 1947. And as we mentioned, his feast day is on April 28th. Now, the next saint, a little lesser known, feast day also on April 28th, is St. Peter Chanel. Now, St. Peter, also a Frenchman, he was born on the 12th of July in 1803 in Montrevel and Bresse in Ain, France, which I probably butchered all of that. So, born in France, ordained a priest in the year 1827, and he spent a few years as a diocesan priest. However, kind of similar to St. Louis, he quickly found out that his passion was really for missionary work, for getting out there to getting out of the churches, trying to get out to the people and to preach specifically to them, kind of on the street corners. However, his calling wasn't necessarily to the people of France. He began to read letters during his time as a priest, as a diocesan priest, of the great missionaries in faraway lands, and he became just on fire with this zeal to kind of join them, kind of go to the peripheries and really preach the gospel to people who had never heard it before. So in 1831, he joined the Society of Mary, which is also known as the Marist Fathers. So he's joined this order and spent 5 years kind of teaching in seminary, forming other priests. However, this great desire to kind of preach to, non-Catholics in faraway lands, this was still very much weighing on him. So in the year 1837, he received permission to do this work, and he was sent to Oceania, so way out in Polynesia, out in the South Pacific. He was sent out there, and he served on an island known as Futuna, which, if you look on a map, Futuna is basically in the middle of a giant triangle with the small island of Fiji, the American Samoa Islands, what's now known as the American Samoa Islands, and then also Tuvalu, which is another very small island country. So you have these very small islands. In the middle of these small islands is another small island known as Futuna. And at this point, in year 1837, no missionary had ever been here. They'd never heard of Christianity or the gospel or anything. So he was the first missionary to arrive. And of course, early on, he was met with resistance from these kind of tribal natives who lived there. And, at first it was a bit of a struggle to kind of adjust to that. However, Father Chanel eventually did learn their language, so that kind of allowed him to kind of communicate with them. And, as kind of the years went on, he started to kind of get some converts, and it kind of came to a head as he started to get more and more converts of these natives, when the king of the island, kind of the chieftain, named Niuliki, one of his sons, actually, a son named Metala, actually wanted to convert to Catholicism. So of course, as the chieftain, the father wasn't too happy about that. So he got kind of his favored warrior and also his son-in-law, a man named Musu. He got this guy to basically agree to kill Father Chanel, right? So, they kind of set it up that this Musu went to confront the priest. He kind of had a run-in with Metala, this son of the chieftain who wanted to convert to Catholicism. And there was a bit of a battle between the two. Musu was wounded, and he kind of used feigning like, oh, I'm wounded, I need medical attention. He used that opportunity to actually get in, kind of Father Chanel's good graces, and then through that, he actually killed Father Chanel in cold blood. I think it's reported that he kind of bludgeoned him to death with a club. So Father Chanel died on 20th of April, 1841. And, within, very soon after his death, when the Marist kind of society found out about this, they sent kind of 2 priests to the island to kind of assess the situation and continue to the work that Father Chanel started. And within 2 years after these 2 new priests arrived, the entire island had converted to Catholicism. So it's kind of this miraculous example that was kind of set by Father Chanel and his courage. That now the entire island ended up converting to Catholicism. And that included Musu, the man who actually killed Father Chanel. He converted to Catholicism, kind of repented for the murder that he did. And actually, on his deathbed, this warrior Musu Musu, he actually expressed his desire to be buried kind of in the dirt outside of the church that Father Chanel was buried in, with kind of the idea that kind of his last act of supplication, last act of repentance for what he did would be that people would have to walk over his body in order to get, to the holy tomb of this priest to venerate him. So, this very holy Father Chanel, in his memory, all of this island was converted. And in the year, on 17th of November in the year 1889, Pope Leo XIII declared Peter Chanel the first martyr of Oceania, so the first Catholic martyr to die down in the South Pacific. And then on the 12th of June in 1954, Pope Pius XII canonized St. Peter Chanel. So both St. Louis de Montfort and St. Peter Chanel, very, very similar kind of paths, and also both beatified by the same man, Pope Leo XIII, and canonized by the same man, Pope Pius XII. So just, kind of funny there. And their feast days on the same day, April 28th. So next saint we have is another really famous one, St. Catherine of Siena on April 29th. So St. Catherine of Siena was born on the 25th of March in 1347, so, right on the feast of the Annunciation. And she was actually the 23rd child to her parents. So she had a lot of brothers and sisters. And her parents were Jacopo di Benicassa and his wife Lapa. Jacopo being, kind of like a very modest kind of dye merchant in the city of Siena where they lived. And from a very early age, St. Catherine, she was just very devoutly religious. It's said that from the age of 5, she was seeing visions of Christ. And at the age of 7, she came to the conclusion that she wanted to dedicate herself as a virgin to Christ. And, even, as she, got older, of course, her mother wanted to kind of marry her off because, that was kind of the thing that you did with all of your children back in this time period. And, St. Catherine, of course, would resist this, since she had a calling to be devoted to Christ. And, it was, it said that she would cut her hair off, to kind of make herself look less attractive to potential suitors, to kind of thwart her mother's whims, which, eventually her mother kind of gave up and realized she wasn't getting anywhere with that. So as a teenager, St. Catherine became a Third Order Dominican, and then spent kind of 3 years kind of secluded in prayer, and during this time just had many celestial experiences and many visions of Christ. She underwent an experience which is known as the spiritual espousals. She made this consecration, as a girl to be a virgin for Christ, and kind of came into, a very spiritual closeness with Christ during this time. So, and after those 3 years are up, she kind of came back home. She kind of went back into the world and started kind of gathering a following of disciples who were very interested in kind of her preaching. And just throughout the years, she continued to have these visions, continued to kind of live this very holy life. In the year 1370, she had a vision of like hell, purgatory, and heaven. A lot of her views and her preachings were looked at with a bit of suspicion by some of the authorities, some of the clergy and other religious around. However, the Dominicans eventually did an investigation of her and realized that there wasn't any error there. So she was kind of cleared of any suspicion and kind of allowed to continue doing what she was doing. She played a key role in what is known as the Western Schism, which we talked about a couple weeks ago with St. Vincent Ferrer. So the Western Schism, as we discussed then, was this period in history where the popes had lived in Avignon for like many decades. The King of France kind of enticed the Pope to kind of come and live under the protection of the King of France for a bit. And this was just a period of, the King of France had a lot of control over the papacy. So, there's a lot of corruption going on there. A lot of the laity were very upset about that. Especially the people of Rome were very upset that their bishop never lived in Rome. So, a very controversial time for the Pope, very shameful on the authority kind of the church as, this independent, the independent vicar of Christ. So, during this time, St. Catherine, was a very persistent advocate for the Pope returning to Rome. And, this is also amongst times when she's going around to the different city-states of Italy, trying to broker peaces and kind of keeps a lot of the political establishment from kind of erupting into chaos and war. And, she would very constantly pester Pope Gregory XI, telling him to leave Avignon and come back to Rome, which eventually he did agree to do. So he arrived back in Rome. And, as we discussed last time we talked about the schism, Pope Gregory actually was in Rome for a bit, but then decided he wanted to go back to Avignon. However, before he did that, he ended up passing away in 1378. One other thing about St. Catherine, though, before we get a little more into the rest of the schism and the rest of her story, in the year 1375, it said that she received the stigmata, right? So the stigmata being, kind of the wounds of Christ. Except, for her, they didn't actually appear on her hands. She specifically requested that she didn't want to display the stigmata. However, she still had the pain of it, so you couldn't see it, but she was still able to feel, the wounds of Christ, on her person. But anyway, so Pope Gregory died in 1378 in Rome. Pope Urban was elected to replace him. However, as we discussed last time, talking about the schism, some of the cardinals kind of defected from this, and then ended up electing a pretender anti-pope who then went back to Avignon. So now that kind of came into this period where you had several different popes in several different places. And during the kind of the final 2 years of her life between 1378 and 1380, St. Catherine worked tirelessly just for unity in the church, serving the poor, and just to kind of get the church back on track from this kind of very corrupt period. She died after a sickness on the 29th of April in 1380 in Rome, and she left behind a legacy of many great writings in the Tuscan Italian language, known as, one work known as the Dialogue, also a lot of letters that she wrote, and then, a series of, personal prayers that she composed. She was canonized in the year 1461 by Pope Pius II, and today she's known as the co-patron of Italy, along with St. Francis of Assisi. So her feast day is, as we've said, on April 29th. The next saint that we have is on April 30th, and this is Pope St. Pius V, another really huge name. So Pope St. Pius V was born Antonio, and then later he changed his name to Michel when he became a priest. He was born Antonio Ghisleri, and like I said, later became Michel Ghisleri. And he was born on 17th of January in 1504 in Lombardy, which is kind of in northern Italy, around where Milan is. And he was born to a very poor tradesman family. And then from a very early age, though, he was taken kind of under the wing of the Dominicans of Voghera in Italy, and kind of educated and trained in just this, kind of very humble, austere life. When he became of age, he officially entered the Dominicans, becoming an ordained Dominican in 1528. And then as a priest, he spent 16 years just teaching theology and philosophy as a Dominican. He was just really devoted to spreading the spirit of St. Dominic, spreading his teachings. And Pope St. Pius V, or I guess Father Ghisleri, as he would have been known at this time in his life, he was known for just, again, being a very holy man. He was very devoted to fasting. He would spend long night hours in meditation and prayer. And then also he was known to kind of travel on foot without a cloak, kind of in a very penitential way, to kind of eschew some of the more luxuries of the time, like a horse or something as simple as a cloak. So in the year 1556, he was actually consecrated a bishop by Pope Paul IV. And he was made Bishop of Sutri, which is kind of in, I believe, in kind of central Italy. And, as a bishop, he was very zealous against heresy. This is 1556. So this is a couple decades after the Protestant Reformation started in 1517. Italy didn't necessarily see as much of the Reformation, but still there's a lot of those ideas kind of going around, a lot of fervor for reform, but also kind of more for reform, but also for revolution in the church. And kind of sundering of that unity. So he worked very tirelessly to combat this. He was selected as an inquisitor of the faith. Just kind of in charge of kind of the kind of seeking out heresy and rooting it out and destroying it, to put it in a bit of a dramatic way. But of course, for those of you who are a little more familiar with the Inquisitions, it wasn't just kind of just burn all the heretics alive, as, Monty Python might have you think.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
But, just finding these heretics and trying to rehabilitate them, like trying to get them to recant, explaining to them why their views are false, putting them on trial, and, just kind of trying to convince win their souls back for the truth, kind of convincing them that their ideas are faulty. In 1557, so 1 year after he became a bishop, he actually became a cardinal. And then it was during this time that he was kind of officially named the head inquisitor, of the Papal States. Right after this, he was made Bishop of Mondovi, so he was kind of transferred to a different see. And then just continued to be this unflinching defender of orthodoxy. So much so that he actually criticized the Pope. So Pope Pius IV, who was a Medici of the famed Medici family, but not the Tuscan Medicis from Florence, who are the most famous, but a kind of a branch of the Medicis from Milan, from northern Italy. Pope Pius IV wanted to name his cousin or his nephew or some relative of his. He wanted to name his 13-year-old relative Ferdinand de' Medici. He wanted to name him a cardinal, which Cardinal Ghisleri was like, no, you can't do that. You can't just take a 13-year-old kid and just make him a cardinal because he want more of your family in the College of Cardinals. That's not how this works. He also went up against the Holy Roman Empire, Maximilian II. The emperor wanted to kind of abolish ecclesial celibacy in his realm. Again, during the Protestant Reformation, when there was a lot of change in that way that a lot of Protestants didn't agree with clerical celibacy. So, the Holy Roman Empire wanted to just do away with it entirely. But Cardinal Ghisleri was not okay with that. And was a very staunch kind of advocate for, keeping that practice of clerical celibacy. So when Pope Pius IV died in 1566, the College of Cardinals elected Cardinal Ghisleri as Pope. So he took the name Pius V. And, this was a couple years after the closing of the Great Council of Trent. So Council of Trent started in 1545. It was convened in light of the Reformation. And, the fathers of that council really wanted to kind of codify all of these issues that were being raised by the Reformation to say, okay, this is where we stand as a church. And we then want to take that and kind of go out and kind of re-evangelize, the Counter-Reformation. So that council lasted from 1545 to 1563. So 3 years after that, the council ended. Pope Pius V took over, and he was kind of tasked now with implementing the council. For those of us who, for all of us, since we've all been around in the wake of Vatican II, we know how difficult it can be to implement a council. You have all these grand ideas that you want to do. However, different factions have different ideas of how those things should be implemented. So one of the first things that he focused on was kind of just reforming the church, in that he rooted out corruption and just wanted to really focus on the Reformation specifically. He ordered the founding of seminaries, newer seminaries that were able to just kind of give a more holistic instruction in the faith, so that, priests weren't so unable to kind of defend the basic truths of Catholicism. He published a new version of the Roman Missal, and of course the famous Tridentine Mass, as that we are familiar with today, came out of the Council of Trent and the Pope Pius V's implementation of that. He also established a confraternity of Christian doctrine, these classes for the young. So if all of you remember CCD way back when, I think they've changed the name of it since I was around. I'm not really sure what the name is now, but we still have the same type of thing. Basically, we can thank Pius V for that, basically making sure that children are very well educated in the knowledge of the faith. And he also zealously sought to enforce reforms against church abuses, both liturgical and also just, things like the nepotism under Pius IV that he complained about, that he was an advocate about, violations in, priestly vows and things like that. So he worked very tirelessly to kind of implement these reforms. He built many hospitals also for the sick and poor in Rome, fed the hungry when he could, and just gave, a lot of the money that was kind of meant for papal banquets and things. He just gave that money to the poor and, just tried to kind of help them out instead of kind of enriching himself and, kind of running his court lavishly. So he also made the decision to kind of wear the Dominican cassock, so that white cassock, as Pope, which of course is likely one of the reasons why, a lot of future popes would take to wearing white, which is basically a staple nowadays. There was a lot of foreign issues he also had to combat, like Elizabethan England, which was oppressing Catholics around this time, and also the great Battle of Lepanto happened under his watch. We'll get into Lepanto, in October when the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary comes up. So I won't get too deep into Lepanto now because there's a lot of cool things to say about it. But basically, what the Battle of Lepanto was that you had the Ottoman Turks were encroaching upon Christendom. They were kind of making their way in the Balkans. They destroyed the Byzantine Empire about 100 years before, and they were just trying to make inroads and to kind of take over Italy, take over kind of more Christian territory. So Pius V called up the Holy League. A lot of the nations were kind of squabbling amongst themselves. The Reformation was still going on, so there wasn't a lot of help to come to him. However, he was able to kind of band together a small group of faithful armies really a navy, because they needed to beat the Ottomans on sea, and then to go out and bring the battle to the Ottomans. And before the battle started, he kind of implored Catholics around Christendom around that time to pray the Rosary for good success in this battle. And the navy led by Don Juan of Austria stood up against the Ottomans, beat them really badly. And just in the vigor of this great victory, the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary was instituted by Pius V on the 7th of October 1571, which is the day of the battle. So up until nowadays, we celebrate that day as our Feast of the Rosary, also known in some instances as Our Lady of Victory. And this just great feast about this great victory. A great victory where if the Holy League didn't win, Christendom as we know it may have been soon after destroyed. So Pope St. Pius V died actually only a couple of months after the Battle of Lepanto. He died on the 1st of May in 1572, so the next year. He was beatified by Pope Clement X in 1672, and then he was canonized by Clement XI in 1712. And as we said, his feast day is April 30th. So the next couple saints, I don't have as much about just because, a lot going on this week with the octave and the passing of the Pope and everything. So I'm just going to kind of give a quick highlights reel of the next couple of saints. On May 1st, we have St. Joseph the Worker, which not too much more to say about St. Joseph. We just had his feast day a couple weeks ago. St. Joseph the Worker, though, is a specific devotion to St. Joseph, kind of focusing on his role as a worker, as a craftsman, as a carpenter. It was instituted by Pope Pius XII in 1955. To kind of give like a kind of a Catholic answer to the kind of the May Day celebrations. Of International Workers' Day that happens on May the 1st every year. Of course, that's something that's very near and dear to a lot of communist groups and kind of more socialist groups. So just opportunity for us Catholics to kind of remember workers in our own way, and very especially one of the greatest workers in our tradition, who is Saint Joseph himself, that silent yet stalwart protector of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Child Christ. On May the 2nd, we have Saint Athanasius, who I wish I could have gotten a little more into Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, a great saint who lived in the 4th century. He was one of the staunchest defenders of Christ's divinity. During the time of the Council of Nicaea. He was vehemently against the Arians, who did not believe that Christ was divine. And he's known for being run out of Alexandria several times over the course of his service as bishop there by the Arians. They just, he'd get reinstated, and then the Arians would take power, or an emperor would kind of be friendly to the Arians, and then they'd kick him out, but then he'd come back. So just this really courageous figure who was a stalwart defender of kind of Orthodox Christianity as we know it. Amidst kind of this very rampant Arian heresy that sprang up in the wake of the legalization of Christianity in the empire. And finally, on May 3rd, we actually have two saints on this day. It's a joint feast day for St. Philip and St. James the Apostles. So not too much to elaborate about them. Two of very early followers of Christ. Two of his closest apostles. St. Philip and then St. James, being St. James the Less, son of Alphaeus, not to be confused with St. James the Greater, who was son of Zebedee, right? So one of the two St. James that were apostles are celebrated on this day. So that's all we have. A lot going on this week. Very packed, very packed week with a lot of high profile saints here. I wish you all a very happy Divine Mercy Sunday. Happy, second week of Easter. And I will see you all next week. God bless.